A lot of you know Randy Evans. He's chaired the Georgia State GOP conventions for as long as I can remember. I may have been in elementary school when you started. And he does such an incredible fine job. He once told me, he said, in parliamentary law, I made an A. And he continues to demonstrate that he made an A in parliamentary law. He conducts an honest convention, gives people time to talk, and we're very proud that he's a Madison Forum member. On top of that, he's a senior partner at McKenna Law in Aldridge, one of the leading law firms in Atlanta, the governor's personal attorney. Newt Gingrich's attorney for all of his companies. So I do have one bone to pick with you, Ray.
All right.
And I've never discussed it with you, but I sent you an email years ago before Obama was elected. And I said, please tell George Bush, because I didn't have access. I knew you dined at the White House from time to time.
Right.
Please tell George Bush that he must fully vet Obama. Otherwise, we're going to have, and I used the phrase, festering sore that has to be resolved, and it was George Bush's responsibility. It's unfair to put you on the spot right now. It's his responsibility to protect us from enemies, foreign and domestic. But anyway, I'll save that question and comment for later, but we're very proud. He's going to speak on presidential primaries, presidential candidates this morning. And Randy, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I thought what we would do, first of all, I'm a little hoarse. From last week, I was in 6 states over the course of the week, so by the time I got to Saturday, all that was left was a little bit of a rasp. But I thought, obviously, I couldn't begin without talking about the events of the week. And this is probably, in constitutional terms, one of the most significant weeks that we've had in the country's history. And the reason that's true is something that I wanted to just spend a brief moment on as you think about it. Obviously, there are significant partisan differences about the outcome, as there always are when the Supreme Court rules. Some people that, many of our colleagues who are Democrats celebrated the president's ruling on Obamacare. Candidly, many Republicans privately celebrated because they didn't want to have to deal with the fix. But the bottom line is that we got a ruling that changes the landscape, and it presents a clear and present danger, really, to the very foundation for how the country was built.
That's right.
As a lawyer, there is no principle more sacred for a civilized society to succeed, to prosper, than the rule of law. Period. End of question. That you have to have the rules of law. If I have a contract and I write the contract, we have to have a rule of law that says that if the other side doesn't perform, I have a remedy. What we have seen with this latest round of Supreme Court decisions, combined with the policies of the Obama administration, is a systematic disintegration of the fundamental predicate of the rule of law. And I'll use one really good example, which is the Obamacare ruling. As most people who in this room know, it really came down to 4 words that appeared in a statute. And everybody, including the 6 who voted to uphold the statute and the 3 who voted to strike it down, or strike the subsidies down, agreed that the words that were improperly, inartfully, poorly, whatever phrase you want to use, in other words, they didn't get the job done. Now, there are a couple of ways in which the court could have gone consistent with the rule of law to address that issue, because it's not the first time it's happened. What is particularly worrisome about both the Texas housing case and the Obamacare case is that the court chose to justify its reasoning based on outcome. Basically, the idea being it doesn't really matter how we get there. It's a result-oriented decision. Now think about the implications of that. If you're in my profession, which is to be a lawyer, the most important thing of the rule of law is predictability. If that's the law, I may not like the law, I may not want the law, but that's the law, right? Isn't that how it works? And if you don't like the law, you don't want the law, you can always elect somebody else and change the law, but until it is changed, that is the law. The moment we move from that fundamental predicate to outcome-oriented policies to run the government, what happens to the rule of law? So, let me give you this illustration. We have on the books laws relating to immigration. What is the president's response been to that? Well, if I don't like it, I'm not going to enforce it. We have on the books laws dealing with Obamacare, and what does the Supreme Court say? Well, even though the statute is defective, even though the statute doesn't work, because it doesn't achieve the result that everybody thinks it should achieve, we're going to uphold it. What's hidden beneath those policies is the fundamental abandonment of the idea that actually the rule of law is what governs. Instead, what starts to govern is this collective well-being of what the consensus is of where we should go and what we should do. The moment you do that, the first sign you have to learn from history is you will see the systematic then aggregation of power. Because rather than power being limited by the rule of law, there is now no limit to the aggregation of power because the rule of law is at the boundary, right? And so what you'll then do is to start to see the aggregation of power, and that's what we see here. The decision, for example, that came down yesterday, while much will be made of it on the social issue of gay rights, the far broader implication was the shift in the balance of power between the federal government and the state government to the federal government. So we end up with, at the federal level, a president willing to expand power to the maximum extent possible. A Congress who has largely been relegated to the side because it only has two powers to check the president. You know what the two powers are? One is purse and one is impeachment. Well, they made it clear they're not going to impeach him because he's only got 2 terms left, or two years left. And the power of the purse has been taken away because they're afraid to shut the government down because of the negative fallout. Well, if you take away the only 2 ways you have to check the power of the president, should anybody be surprised that the president then gains more and more power, and it's literally a concentration of power like we have not seen, since the 1800s. And in that regard, we're at a pretty significant risk. And so, on the RNC, which is where I am, our job obviously is to try to create a process that's much more orderly that affords us the chance to offer up a nominee that has the best chance of winning and of getting the country back on track. The oddest part to me is the inherent contradiction between the court, to give you a flavor, the court's opinion on Obamacare was what I call the AIG decision. If you remember, when we had the huge economic bust, the idea was AIG was too big to fail. Remember that?
Yes, yeah.
So the whole gist of John Roberts' opinion in the Obamacare is that it's now too big for us to let it fail. Doesn't matter what the law is, doesn't matter that it's defective, doesn't matter we all agree it's worded improperly, it's too big to let it fail. And so the net effect is that, that we've just seen this concentration. In history, at a pivotal point like this, one of two things typically happens. Either the balance of power reorients itself. The Congress finds a way to reorient itself. The court finds a way to reorient itself. You get a president who actually stays within the boundary of the law, or you get to the point of no return, to quote from Phantom from the Opera, with regard to the acquisition of power. And that's really the worrisome part that we see, because if we had one more president whose goal it was to systematically accumulate power, we just, at some point, the Constitution largely, if it has not already been done so, it becomes largely irrelevant. It's a guiding document. It's a guiding principle, but it really has no teeth to it. And what was the one thing that the Founding Fathers feared most? Anybody know?
Not controlled judiciary.
No, a king. At first, the one thing that the Founding Fathers feared most is the concentration of power above the rule of law into a king. So everything was designed deliberately to make the process as inefficient as possible, not because they wanted an inefficient government, but because they knew that inefficiency is the best way to slow the accumulation of power into a single person.
Makes sense.
And so that's why we're at a tipping point, and that's why we've taken at the RNC really dramatic actions to change the way we go about selecting our nominee. And I'll give you a few, and then I'm going to take 10 minutes of questions just to make sure everybody has their chance to get an answer to whatever question. The first thing we did was we've cut the number of debates. Last time we had 23 debates. We had already had 3 debates by now. And it turned into a slice and dice show. And meanwhile, the president's running for re-election with nobody shooting at him. And our folks are gutting each other.
That's right.
So we've cut the number of debates from 23 to 9. If the process goes on far deeper into the primary schedule, we'll add 3 more to accommodate the fact that we went long. But right now we have 9 debates. Those debates are sanctioned debates. In order to be sanctioned, a network has to agree to criteria for the moderators, for the panelists. Because we don't want another George Stephanopoulos or Candy Crowley deciding that somehow they're running for president and they're going to inject themselves in the debate. So that's one thing. The second thing we've done is to compress the process, just so that you know. Last time the process for running for president was 6.5 months. This time, the entire process, if you don't include the 4 carve-out states, which I'll talk about in a moment, will be 75 days from beginning to end. And we push the start date back, so the start date is the first day of February. Iowa will go, New Hampshire will go, South Carolina will go, Nevada will go. All of that happens in February. 4 states, they all go in February just like they all do. And then on March 1st, every other state is eligible to go, and currently 14 states have all decided to go on March 1st. They are virtually all the southern states, so that there will be a huge imprint left by the South on who the eventual nominee will be. It will be clearly the one day that narrows the field. And that will happen on March 1st. Between March 1st and March 15th will be a cooling off period. Now, what do I mean by cooling off? I mean that during that time period, winners of primaries get proportion delegates. So if you got 30% of the vote, you get 30% of the delegates. You got 40% of the vote, you get 40% of the delegates. You get 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the delegates. So that nobody really could get to a majority during this period. And the reason we did that was to make sure we didn't have a runaway nominee. Somebody who hasn't been fully vetted, who ends up the nominee, right out of the box. Because you do need to have somebody who has the mettle to take the beating that the president takes day in, day out. On March 15th, every state can then go to winner take all. That means if you win the most votes in that state, you get all the delegates. So you win 50% or 51% of the vote, you don't get 51% of the delegates, you get 100% of the delegates. So the March 15th date is designed to speed it up. Not surprisingly, two things have happened. One, Florida, which has both Marco Rubio and Jeb Bush, two of the leading contenders, has decided to go on March 15th to have their imprint among their two favorite sons. And then we've seen the Midwest start to aggregate to create another second, effectively Super Tuesday. Now remember, if you've only got 7 Tuesdays and you've got 56 contests, because we let the territories select delegates too, then in that process, you're going to have many Tuesdays that have more than one state. So we're going to have a lot of little mini national primaries through the process. The final thing that we did was we moved the back end up. If you remember, our convention used to be in August, September. The problem is, you can't release your FEC presidential funds until you have a nominee. So our nominee wraps up the nomination in May, doesn't get access to funds to defend themselves until August. Meanwhile, you've got the pounding that's just coming day in and day out for 4 months. So we have moved the convention all the way up to the 3rd week of July, and the effect of that is to move the last primary up, because you have to have your primary done 45 days before the convention, which means the middle of May. So now you've shortened it from 6.5 months down to effectively March to the middle of May, or about 75 days. And so you're just going to see this compression. Now, we all know we have a lot of candidates. Today, as of today, we have 14. We expect 2 more. I think Chris Christie will announce next week, and I think we're still waiting on John Kasich.
Scott Walker.
And the final one, who wants to be last, will be Scott Walker, who wants to be the last announced candidate. So you're going to have, at the end of the day, around 16 candidates. 16, maybe 17, but 16 candidates, all vying. If you have compression, but you have more candidates, you're going to end up with a couple possibilities. One possibility is you're going to have a clear top tier emerge early that'll literally kind of wipe out the rest of the field. Or what's going to happen is you're going to have a complete splitter. So let me give you a good example. Let's take March 1st. All right? Now, who do we think is going to win Arkansas on March 1st?
Huckabee.
Mike Huckabee. Now, who do we think is going to win Texas on March 1st? Probably Cruz. Well, the polling is Cruz is really pretty far ahead. But one of the Texans, let's just say that. Who's going to win Florida?
Rubio.
That's right. So you can see what will happen is, rather than the process narrowing the field, everybody's going to pretty much win their home state, which does what? Nothing to narrow the field, because they'll all come out of March 1st and they'll all have delegates in their pockets. And then when you start to March 4th, so oddly enough, a system that was designed to create an orderly gravitational pull to narrowing the field could have literally the opposite effect, and we could actually have the first brokered convention, in a century. Because you could literally because you get there so fast, it's hard for anyone to gravitate full, which is an interesting proposition, that you in fact could have a convention. Now, I personally think a brokered convention would be great. I think everybody would watch. Right now, I mean, who really watches the Republican or the Democratic convention? They're both coronations of their nominees. But if you were to actually get there, and it's still in doubt, I could see, the whole country would be watching the Super Bowl of politics. This is the AFC, but the NFC's already got its champion. Here we are, we're ready to rock and roll, but we don't know our nominee yet. So I think that's it. I think the other notable thing is just the diversity of the candidates that are running. I mean, we have Ben Carson, we have Carly Fiorina, we have Marco Rubio, we have Bobby Jindal. You just go down the list. I mean, it's anybody that suggested that it's the old white man party need only look at the stage. Now, we had 2 curveballs thrown at us, to be candid with you. One curveball was Fox's decision that they were going to limit the first debate to 10 people. That will be a challenge. It is notable, however, that it's pretty short-lived because the second debate will be at the Reagan Center, and it will permit every candidate who meets the threshold to participate. And it'll probably have 2 panels. So what you'll have is a temporary contraction in August, immediately followed by re-expansion in September. And then after that, the numbers will do the work about, who's doing where. You have to admit, many of my colleagues, I sit on this little central committee called the debate committee, and there's just a handful of us, and, we're making all these decisions, and many of our colleagues are wringing their hands over Donald Trump being on the stage. My reaction is, the more the merrier.
Yeah.
Entertain for once. One time, have some life up there. I mean, Lord knows.
Asking the questions of it if you won't.
I'm just, the idea that we would have another John McCain or Mitt Romney be dull as dirt up there, walking through laboriously. I mean, to me, we live in a different world and we have to adapt to that world. And the way you adapt to that world is you let people who are of different personalities, different opinions, all get up there, and then we have the best pick. I always say it's like this. My favorite ice cream shops are the ones that offer the most flavors. My favorite presidential debates are the ones that offer the most flavors, because then you can pick from and narrow it down to exactly the flavor you want. Now, clearly Jeb Bush is going to have the resources. I will say I've been fortunate enough, because of my position on the RNC, to sit down in a one-on-one session and visit with every candidate who's running. And I know most of them, candidly. And they all have strengths and weaknesses, but we don't have a perfect candidate. And the one thing I want to prepare you for is that by the time we went through the process, they're going to be nicked up and scarred, because it's the very nature of the process. Their job is to win out against each other. So if you put 16 gladiators into a ring and say there will only be one champion, by the time it's done, you can expect that one champion to have bruises and knocks and and warts and cuts and scrapes, and they're not going to be as pretty as they are today, because they will have went through the process. So we have to be prepared for that, and we still have to know that in the end, even though we may not get the one any one of us wants, we're going to get better than what they have. They have gotten stuck with a candidate who is just on a steady downward trajectory.
She is,
And I'm fine with that. I am fine if they want to tie their wagon to somebody who lost to Barack Obama and who has only gotten worse since. I don't have any trouble with that whatsoever. So I'm not one of these that's like, oh, we've got to knock her out of the race. I'm like, nah, I think she's exactly, because in many ways she is their Bob Dole. She is their John McCain, which is the party that they used to be, but not the party they are today. And I don't know that she can deliver their base. The final point, and then I'll take questions. There is no doubt in my mind that the media is grossly underestimating the sheer anger that is now boiling inside of people who aren't talking about it. It really is. I think they're completely, it reminds me of when we won the House back. I remember that year well, and I remember sitting down with John Boehner, and I said, this election was over in February. When the president signed the Affordable Care Act, that was it. I said, the average American checked the box and said, I'm gonna vote Republican in the congressional elections, and they didn't think about it again, because they were just mad about it. And I think you're gonna see that happen here. I think this week, with the, what we would say in the South, rooster crowing by the president, combined with the average American saying, what in the world are you doing? And a core fundamental just bitterness. And what we have to do is we have to, rather than count on that bitterness, we have to do what every successful president who has led to a commanding victory has done, which is offer hope. It is not impossible to get the country back. My biggest concern, candidly, with Russia adding 40 missiles to its ICBMs, with terrorists getting dirty nukes and walking around and beheading people in France, is that we don't make it to November. But I think if we can make it that far, we're going to have a very good year, and I think you could see a repeat of Reagan's win over Mondale at that proportion, because I think the bitterness and the unsettling and uncertainty. I always ask when I speak, is there anybody in this room right here, right now, that feels safer than you did 8 years ago? Safer from crime on the street, safer from the terrorists in the Middle East, safer from the Russians and the North Koreans? Is there any one person who feels safer? And at the end of the day, when people unanimously say no, you know that we've already hit the core issue that is the most important function of the federal government, which is to protect its citizens. And I think that in the end, you're going to see that just bubble up as well. So, Mike, is that okay?
Randy, thank you very much.